The ballroom of the Ashcombe Hotel had been dressed to look like it belonged to no single century: gold leaf on the ceiling, candles in iron sconces, white peonies stacked so high on every table that they trembled when the string quartet leaned into a crescendo. Everything about the room had been built to say one word to the 300 guests inside it, and the word was money. Nora Bellamy walked through that room in a dress that had taken 4 fittings to get right, and she carried herself the way she carried herself into courtrooms: spine straight, chin level, eyes moving just a fraction faster than anyone assumed a bride's eyes should move on her own wedding day. People smiled at her as she passed. She had learned, over the 11 months she'd spent engaged to Julian Voss, exactly what those smiles meant. She got in. The girl from a 2-bedroom house in Marsh Hollow had married into the Voss name, and now she got to stand under chandeliers that cost more than her father's pension. Nora smiled back at each of them because that was expected, but she catalogued the smiles the way she catalogued evidence: filing them, dating them, waiting to see which ones would still be there in a year. Julian was 3 feet away, shaking hands the way his father had taught him to shake hands: a beat too long, a grip a touch too firm, the kind of handshake that wanted something back. He laughed with senators and old money and men who ran companies whose names appeared in newspapers Nora read every morning before court. When his eyes found hers across the room, his face did something she had seen 100 times and never once let herself examine closely. It softened just enough to look like love, and underneath it, something else held perfectly still, like an animal that had learned patience. Nora was not naive. She had spent 6 years as a litigator clawing her way into rooms that didn't want her, winning cases against firms 3 times the size of the one that finally hired her, and she had done it by noticing the thing under the thing, the tell in a witness's hands, the pause before a lie. She had noticed things about Julian too, small ones, early on. The way he described his family's company, Voss Industrial, in language that was all architecture and no substance. The way his father, Reginald Voss, watched every room like he was pricing it. She had noticed, and she had decided, the way people decide to trust a bridge because everyone else is already standing on it, that it would hold. The first crack didn't arrive as a scream. It arrived as a folded piece of paper, slipped by mistake into a stack of seating charts a nervous waiter handed her, thinking it was the final list of tables. Nora opened it only to check her mother's seat number, and instead her eyes caught wire transfer codes, the names of 3 shell companies she had never heard of, and a signature block stamped with the Voss Industrial seal. It was not a small mistake. It was a map. She felt the room shrink to the size of that page. The music kept playing, the toasts kept rising, laughter kept climbing toward the gilded ceiling, but something inside her had gone cold and exact. She recognized the pattern the way she recognized fraud in the depositions she'd spent years dismantling: consulting fees paid to companies that filed no tax returns, invoices for work no one could describe. And there, twice, underlined faintly in pencil by someone else's hand, the name ferrochemical, the same ferrochemical linked, 6 months earlier, to a warehouse fire that had killed 2 night shift workers and been quietly ruled an accident. Julian had told her, back when she'd first read about the fire in the news, that Voss Industrial had no real relationship with Ferro beyond a minor supply contract. She had believed him, because she had wanted, for once in her disciplined life, to believe someone without cross-examining them first. Now that belief was curdling in her hands. She looked for him and found him near the terrace doors, deep in conversation with his father. Neither man looked festive. Reginald's hand was clamped on his son's shoulder, his mouth barely moving as he spoke, and Julian's eyes, when they lifted and found Nora across the room, hardened into something she had never been shown before. He knew. Whatever this paper was, he knew about it, and he had been hoping, with the calm confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything, that she would never see it. Nora folded the document with steady hands and slid it into the small clutch looped around her wrist. She did not run. She did not go pale. She crossed the ballroom the way she crossed a courtroom before delivering a closing argument, and when her mother, Diane, reached for her hand near the head table, eyes shining with pride and worry in equal measure, Nora only pressed her fingers once, briefly, and kept walking. Diane knew her daughter well enough to understand that this composure wasn't peace. It was the sound before a verdict. Julian reached her before she reached the terrace. His public smile was already back in place for the guests watching, but his voice, low and clipped, was not. He asked what she thought she was doing, as though the simple act of walking toward him were already an act of war. Nora told him, quietly, that she needed to speak with him alone. It was a small request, almost gentle. Still, his jaw tightened, because in this marriage he had expected a woman who performed devotion on command, not one who could interrupt his evening with a sentence. They stepped into the corridor behind the terrace, where the music dulled to a heartbeat and the smell of white peonies turned suddenly heavy, almost suffocating. Nora drew the paper from her clutch and held it where he could see it. Julian's eyes dropped to it, then rose to her face, and for one unguarded second the mask came all the way off. What she saw underneath it was not surprise. It was fear, dressed up as fury. He reached out and demanded the document, palm open, voice hard enough that a passing waiter flinched and hurried on. Nora didn't hand it over. She asked him, evenly, why Voss Industrial's money kept finding its way to ferrochemical. Julian's breathing changed. He told her it was old business, internal matters, things she didn't need to understand tonight of all nights. And it was that phrase, didn't need to understand, that struck something old and raw in her, some quiet history of being managed instead of heard. She told him she understood perfectly, and that was exactly why she was asking. The door behind them opened before he could answer. Reginald Voss stepped into the corridor with two men in pale suits trailing him like shadows with cufflinks, and the temperature of the hallway dropped by 10 degrees. He looked at Nora the way he looked at a line item that had come in over budget. He said that big parties always produced confusion, papers switched, stories twisted, and his voice was soft, almost kind, but every word in it carried a blade wrapped in silk. Nora slid the document back into her clutch and said, calmly, that any confusion could be cleared up easily enough with an independent audit. The silence that followed seemed to pull the air out of the corridor. One of the men in pale suits looked away. Julian stepped closer, his eyes lit with something he had always insisted he didn't have in him. And it was in that silence, with the music thinning behind them and 300 guests just beyond the wall, that Julian Voss raised his hand, fast, almost unreal, as if it belonged to some other man entirely, and brought it across Nora Bellamy's face in front of his own father, in front of the caterers, in front of anyone close enough to the door to hear the sound land like a verdict of its own. The sound of it reached the ballroom before the shock did. For one held breath, no one moved, not the string quartet, whose bows hung suspended over their instruments, not the waiters frozen mid-step with trays of champagne catching the chandelier light, not even Julian himself, whose hand remained lifted in the air as though he could not quite believe it had left his side. Nora's head had turned with the force of the blow, her veil sliding loose from its pins, one gloved hand rising slowly to press against the heat spreading across her cheek. She did not cry out. She did not stumble. The pain was real, sharp and immediate, but underneath it something colder and far more useful was already taking shape. The same clarity she had once felt reading a verdict she knew, before the judge finished speaking, was about to change the course of a case. She lowered her hand and looked at Julian as though seeing him for the first time without the softening effect of hope. There was no husband in that face anymore, no partner, no promise of the life they had spoken about in low voices over dinner tables. Only a man who had just shown, in front of his own father, exactly what he believed a wife was for. Reginald did not step forward to comfort her. He did not even flinch. He watched the scene with the flat, assessing patience of a man deciding how much damage had just been done to a balance sheet, and that, more than the slap itself, told Nora everything she needed to know about the family she had married into. Julian tried to speak, his voice already shifting toward performance, already rehearsing the version of the story where the party's stress and her own hysteria had provoked him. Nora didn't give him the room. With a calm that made two of the caterers by the wall take an instinctive step backward, she reached up and drew the ring from her finger. It came free easily, as though it had never truly fit, and the diamond caught the light once before she let it fall, not thrown, not smashed to the floor for drama, simply released, the way you release something that was never really yours, onto the silver tray a trembling waiter was still holding at his side. The small metallic clink it made against the glasses was louder, somehow, than the slap had been. She told him, without raising her voice, that the marriage ended there. She told him the document did not disappear, and neither would the memory of what his hand had just done in front of 30 witnesses. Reginald finally moved, stepping toward her and using her married name as if the 2 syllables alone could pull her back into the family's grip. Nora turned to him and said, simply, that she was still a Bellamy. The sentence cut through the corridor cleaner than anything shouted could have. Her mother reached her first, pushing past the gathering onlookers with tears she refused to let fall from pure fright. But Diane Bellamy's tears, Nora would understand later, were not weakness. They were the sound of a mother watching her daughter walk through fire and come out standing. Julian took one more step forward, hands still low at his side, face now blotched with something between panic and rage, looking, for the first time that night, smaller than the name stitched into his tuxedo lining. Nora walked back through the ballroom under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Some held pity. Some held shock. Many, she knew from long experience with rooms like this one, were already doing arithmetic, calculating which side of this story would be safer to stand on by morning. She let them look. Running would have made her the story. Walking made her the verdict. At the entrance, a familiar face broke from the edge of the crowd, Priya Anand, sharp-eyed and pale, phone already in her hand though she hadn't taken a single photograph. She had been Nora's closest friend since their first year of law school, before Priya had traded litigation for investigative journalism and a newsroom that owed the Voss family nothing. She didn't ask what had happened. She had heard enough of it through the wall. She simply asked quietly if Nora wanted to leave, and when Nora nodded, Priya fell into step beside her without another word, offering nothing but her presence, which right then was worth more than any speech. Outside, the night was absurdly calm, black cars idling in a row, drivers murmuring to one another, security guards pretending they hadn't heard the commotion drifting from inside. Nora stood at the top of the steps for a moment, breathing in air that felt too cold and too clean after the perfume and candle smoke of the ballroom. The dress, which had felt like a promise that morning, now felt like a weight sewn from a lie. Priya opened the car door, but Nora didn't get in right away. She looked back at the lit windows of the hotel and imagined Julian inside, already rearranging the story, already deciding who would be blamed, already preparing the version in which he was the wounded party and she the unstable bride who had ruined her own wedding. She understood, standing there with her cheeks still burning, that the real fight hadn't ended in that corridor. It had only just introduced itself. The Voss family had lawyers on retainer, friendly headlines waiting to be written, judges who owed them favors, and a decades-long talent for turning their own crimes into other people's misunderstandings. Many people, she knew, would tell her to let it go quietly, to take a settlement, to disappear into a smaller life and be grateful it wasn't worse. But the sting on her face wouldn't let her forget what it revealed. If Julian could do this in front of 30 witnesses, chandeliers, and his own father, what exactly had this family been capable of when there had been no one watching at all? In the car, once the engine started and the hotel's lights began sliding past the window, Priya finally asked what had been in the paper that started everything. Nora drew the folded document from her clutch and passed it to her friend, who read it under the dim overhead light, her expression darkening with every line. She recognized ferrochemical. She recognized the warehouse fire. She remembered, faintly, a widow who had tried to speak to the press about it months ago and then vanished from every interview list soon after. Nora watched her friend's face confirm the fear she had been carrying since the ballroom. This was not simply a marriage collapsing. This was a door swinging open onto something far darker, and somewhere behind it, 2 men had died in a fire nobody had wanted looked at too closely. As the car pulled further from the hotel, the city lights blurring into ribbons against the window, Nora rested her head briefly against the cool glass and let herself feel, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of what had just happened. Then she straightened, because grief could wait its turn behind work, and work was the only thing that had ever truly steadied her hands. She asked Priya to say nothing publicly yet. A hurried accusation could be swallowed by the Voss family's money and turned into noise before it ever became truth. A careful one, built brick by brick, could bring down something that had looked, for decades, unshakable. When they reached the modest brownstone Nora had kept even after the engagement, against Julian's gentle, persistent suggestion that she sell it and move fully into his world, the doorman blinked at the sight of her in a wedding gown at nearly midnight and wisely said nothing. Upstairs, the apartment still smelled of the coffee she'd brewed that morning, a lifetime ago. Priya put the kettle on out of old habit while Nora peeled off gloves that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. In the bathroom mirror, the mark on her cheek had deepened to a dull red, ugly and unmistakable. She touched it once, not out of self-pity but almost like a lawyer marking an exhibit, memorizing exactly where the evidence lived on her own skin. She changed out of the dress and into plain clothes, and when she returned to the living room, something in her had visibly reset. Priya recognized the look, the same focus Nora used to wear during finals week, the same quiet, dangerous calm she carried into closing arguments. On the coffee table, Nora placed the document, her phone, and a black notebook she'd owned since law school, its cover soft with use. She wrote 3 names at the top of a blank page: Julian Voss, Reginald Voss, Ferrochemical. Beneath them she began adding dates, wire codes, questions. Priya watched her friend fold pain into method and understood that this was not coldness. It was survival with better handwriting. Near 1 in the morning, Nora's phone began buzzing without pause, guests texting in disbelief, a cousin sending a link to a gossip account already speculating that the bride had suffered a breakdown from the stress of the day. A second post claimed the argument had been about a prenuptial dispute over money. Priya read them aloud and swore under her breath. Nora only noted the timestamps. If the lies were moving this fast, it meant the machine was already awake, and a machine awake this quickly was a machine afraid of something. Julian called 11 times. On the 12th, Nora answered and set the phone on speaker, nodding for Priya to start recording, as the law allowed for calls involving documented harassment. His voice arrived rehearsed and smooth, insisting the whole evening had been an unfortunate overreaction, that she was embarrassing 2 families over what he called a private disagreement blown out of proportion by her own emotions. He told her, almost gently, that no one would believe her word over the Voss name. He told her the document belonged to the company and that keeping it could be considered theft. He told her, finally, that she would regret turning one bad night into a public scandal. Nora let him finish. Then she asked, plainly, if he was admitting to striking her. The silence that followed was brief but told her everything. He still believed she could be managed. She said the conversation was over and that anything further needed to go through her attorney. She hung up before he could recover his footing. She saved the recording, sent an encrypted copy to her own private files and another to Priya, and then called a name she hadn't dialed in over a year, Wesley Okafor, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on an old securities case, a man who once told her, half joking, that families obsessed with polished marble usually had the most skeletons buried beneath it. He answered groggy, but his voice sharpened the instant she said the words ferrochemical. He told her to say nothing further over the phone and asked her to send what she had through a secure channel first thing in the morning. By the time dawn crept along the edges of the curtains, the black notebook already held pages of notes, and the folded document sat in the center of the table like a small, patient bomb. The mark on her face throbbed faintly, but it no longer commanded her attention the way it had hours earlier. What commanded her attention now was the certainty that Julian would not simply vanish from her life because she had ended the marriage. Men like him did not disappear. They returned as threats, as lawsuits, as whispered rumors, as favors called in from friends in high places. And so she would not merely survive what had happened to her. She would make sure that whatever came next could never be dismissed as a private matter behind a hotel corridor door. When the sun fully rose over the city, Nora opened the window and let the cold morning air move through the apartment, carrying with it the faint sound of traffic and the smell of last night's rain on pavement. Priya had fallen asleep on the couch with her phone still in hand. On the table, the notebook already had pages filled and the document rested at its center like a seed that had, for now, only begun to show what it might grow into. Nora touched her cheek once more, not with pity but with memory, and in that instant she understood with total certainty that Julian Voss would never again occupy a place of safety in her life. What she did not yet know was that the true depth of what her new husband and his father had buried went far beyond one warehouse fire, and that the next knock on her office door would come from someone whose entire life had been quietly destroyed to keep the Voss name spotless. The knock came just after 10 the next morning, 3 careful taps against the frosted glass of Nora's office door, the temporary one she had set up in a spare room of her apartment, since returning to her old firm felt, for the moment, impossible. Priya let the woman in. She was perhaps 45, thin coat, hands wrapped tightly around a grocery bag as though it contained something more fragile than bread and eggs. She introduced herself as Marisol Fenn, a former administrative assistant at Ferrochemical, and before she even sat down she asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if it was true that Nora had walked out on the Voss wedding after being struck in front of everyone. When Nora said yes, something in Marisol's shoulders loosened, as if that single confirmation had given her permission to finally exhale. Marisol had kept copies of internal memos for over a year, terrified that she would one day be blamed for something she hadn't caused. She placed a flash drive on the table, hidden earlier inside a box of crackers, and explained that it held emails, falsified purchase orders, photographs of substandard safety equipment, and a message chain in which a Ferro manager noted that Reginald Voss wanted the warehouse expansion finished before any full safety inspection could be scheduled. Nora asked careful questions, not eager ones. Who else had access? What could be independently verified? What risk Marisol herself faced by coming forward? She promised nothing would be released before proper legal protection was arranged. Marisol, who had clearly expected either a broken woman or a vengeful one, seemed startled to instead find a lawyer who took her fear as seriously as her information. Within days, Wesley Okafor confirmed what the flash drive suggested. The shell companies from the wedding night document matched 3 of the vendors in Marisol's files, all funneling payments toward Ferrochemical for consulting services no records showed had ever been performed. The warehouse fire that had killed 2 workers began, according to an internal safety report buried and never submitted, from wiring that inspectors had flagged and been overruled on twice. Julian's name appeared once, in a scheduling note reminding staff that Mr. Voss wanted the completion date moved forward regardless of the pending inspection. It was not yet an unbroken chain to a courtroom, but it was, as Wesley put it grimly over the phone, a very expensive rope for the Voss family to keep hiding. That same afternoon, a courier delivered a legal notice to Nora's apartment. Julian's attorneys accused her of unlawfully retaining confidential corporate property and threatened a defamation suit if she did not issue a public retraction and apology within 48 hours. Nora read it twice, then underlined 3 specific phrases in red ink. In demanding the paper's return, they had confirmed its significance. In calling it confidential, they had admitted the contents weren't simple clerical error. Their own arrogance was building the case against them one sentence at a time. She did not respond publicly. Instead, she filed a formal reply through her own counsel, stating plainly that she had received the document incidentally at a private event, that she had been physically struck in front of witnesses, and that any further contact from the Voss family or their representatives would be treated as part of an established pattern of intimidation. She sent it through official channels only, refusing to let Julian bait her into a shouting match played out across headlines he controlled. The online campaign against her sharpened in cruelty over the following week. Anonymous accounts recirculated old photographs from Nora's law school years, twisting them into insinuations about impropriety with clients. A society columnist known for dining regularly with Reginald Voss wrote that certain women confused ambition with love, and that the Voss family deserved sympathy for weathering an unstable outburst. Priya wanted to expose the columnist's ties to Reginald immediately, but Nora asked her to wait. Without proof connecting the smear campaign directly to Voss money, it would look like 2 women fighting over a broken engagement. With proof, it would look like exactly what it was, a coordinated machine built to bury the truth. That proof arrived 2 days later, when a junior employee at a digital marketing firm reached out to Priya, offering to confirm, in exchange for legal protection, that his agency had been paid by a Voss family account to create and operate the very accounts spreading the rumors. In the same week, a text intended for someone else landed in Priya's inbox by mistake, mentioning a reputation package and alignment with Mr. Voss Sr. The web that had felt only days earlier, like shapeless fear in the dark now, had visible threads, and every thread led back to the same two names. Then came the forged contract. Julian's legal team released a private cohabitation agreement, supposedly signed by Nora weeks before the wedding, in which she agreed to strict confidentiality about all Voss family matters and to sweeping financial concessions should the marriage ever end. Her signature at the bottom mimicked her handwriting with unsettling precision, but not quite perfectly. Nora studied it calmly, noting the pressure of the pen strokes, the missing small flourish she always left on the final letter of her own name without thinking. It was a forgery and a rushed one. Within 48 hours, a private handwriting expert Wesley trusted confirmed digital manipulation in the file itself, mismatched metadata, a signature layered onto a separate background image, no trace of the document ever having been transmitted through any channel Nora had used before the wedding. Reginald Voss had built an empire on the assumption that money moved faster than truth. He had not accounted for a woman who documented everything and panicked at nothing. That evening, Nora gathered everyone at her kitchen table, Priya with her laptop open, Wesley with a folder thick with financial trails, Marisol quiet but steady in the chair nearest the window, and her mother, Diane, pouring coffee no one had asked for because it gave her hands something honest to do. Nora looked around at the small, unlikely alliance that had formed in less than 2 weeks around one folded piece of paper and one open hand raised in anger, and she said, calmly, that the forged contract was the mistake they had been waiting for. A man confident in his innocence did not need to invent evidence. Julian and his father had just handed her, in their desperation to control the story, the clearest proof yet that the story was exactly what she believed it to be, and from that moment forward, it would be the Voss family, not Nora Bellamy, fighting to survive what came next. The days that followed moved with the strange double rhythm of grief and preparation. Mornings spent organizing evidence into folders labeled with careful, clinical precision, nights spent lying awake replaying the sound of a hand against her cheek until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Nora did not allow herself the luxury of collapse. She had learned long ago, in courtrooms full of men who expected her to falter, that composure was not the absence of pain but the decision not to let pain choose her next move. Reginald's assessor found Wesley first, cornering him in a parking garage with an offer dressed up as an opportunity, a generous consulting retainer, paid quietly, in exchange for reinterpreting certain figures before they reached any formal filing. Wesley let him talk, his hand resting on the small recorder in his coat pocket that Nora had asked him to carry since the first threat arrived. When the man finally said the word compensation directly, Wesley asked, plainly, if he was being offered a bribe. The man's face went pale, and he left without finishing his sentence. Another piece slid quietly onto the board. Priya, too, was tested. An editor who owed old favors to the Voss family called to say a story was already prepared, one hinting that Priya had coached witnesses and nursed a personal vendetta against a respectable family. Priya listened without interrupting, then asked, evenly, whether he'd prefer to receive the proof that a Voss-funded agency had built the very smear campaign against Nora before or after his story ran. The line went dead without a goodbye. She sat there for a long moment afterward, realizing that fear, once exposed to daylight, could change which side it stood on. Then came Reginald's visit to Diane's small house on the edge of Marsh Hollow, not to Nora's apartment, where cameras and witnesses might record him, but to the mother, where he assumed grief and gratitude might still be persuaded into silence. He arrived with white lilies and a rehearsed voice full of sorrow, asking Diane to help bring her daughter back to reason, insisting decent families settled their pain privately. Diane, who had spent 30 years being underestimated by men exactly like him, opened the door only the width of the chain lock and told him that a house was no place to hide a crime, and that love needed no bought silence to look clean. When he called Nora ungrateful, Diane shut the door before he could finish the sentence. The home security recording reached Nora within the hour, and something in her, watching it, hardened past any last flicker of doubt. The forensic report on the forged contract arrived fully confirmed soon after, layered signature, incompatible metadata, no trace of transmission on any date claimed. Nora did not release it immediately. She let it sit, a quiet, undetonated certainty, while Julian's lawyers pushed harder, assuming her silence meant retreat. It was, instead, the eye of a storm being carefully aimed. The formal hearing before the Corporate Ethics and Compliance Board was scheduled on a gray Tuesday, and by then reporters had gathered outside long before the doors opened, drawn by rumors the Voss legal team could no longer fully contain. Julian arrived in a dark suit, jaw freshly shaved, wearing the practiced remorse of a man who had rehearsed his expression in a mirror. Reginald, walked a step behind him, composed and cold, flanked by a team too large for men who claimed innocence. Inside, Nora presented the timeline without theatrics. The folded document, the strike in the corridor, the forged contract, the smear campaign, the bribery attempt caught on tape. Julian's attorneys tried to separate each incident into its own harmless category, a private dispute, a business matter, an unrelated marketing decision, but Nora showed the dates lined up like stones on a road they could not walk around. When Julian, pressed, blurted out a detail about the very document he claimed never to have known existed, the room felt the floor shift beneath the defense's argument. Reginald did not look at his son. That silence traveled through the room like a struck bell. Marisol testified next, her voice trembling at first, then steady, describing the buried safety reports and the cost memos prioritizing schedule over inspection. When she finished, no one in the room mentioned marble floors or family name. They only heard, clearly, 2 men who had died preventable deaths. At the recess, Julian caught Nora near a corridor window, his practiced calm cracking at the edges. He said everything had spiraled out of control, that his father carried business dealings he himself had never fully understood, that the two of them could still end this quietly without destroying what remained. He said her name softly, as if the single word could unlock a door he had slammed shut himself. For one unguarded breath, she remembered the man who had once seemed gentle across candlelit dinners, and grief moved through her like a current. Then he said, low and sharp, that if she continued, Marisol would be ruined, Wesley discredited, Priya blacklisted, her mother worn down by lawsuits until she broke. Nora felt the old fear tighten in her chest, and beneath it, a colder, steadier resolve. She told him he had just confirmed exactly why he needed to be stopped. Back inside, board members reviewed the recorded threat, the confirmed forgery, the bribery attempt, and the financial trail tying Pharaoh's falsified safety records directly to decisions made at the highest levels of Voss Industrial. The panel's chairwoman set down her pen and looked first at Reginald, then at Julian, and announced that the board was recommending an immediate freeze on Voss Industrial's public contracts pending a full criminal referral. Julian's face drained of color. Reginald, for the first time in the entire proceeding, turned his head slowly toward his son, not with sympathy, but with the flat, calculating look of a man deciding exactly where to cut his losses. And Nora, watching that single glance pass between father and son, understood that the empire built on silence had just begun, quietly and irreversibly, to devour itself from the inside. The board's ruling did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived the way real endings usually do, in dry legal language read aloud by a woman in a gray blazer, and yet the room seemed to tilt on its axis the moment she finished speaking. Reporters outside caught the news before the doors had fully opened, and by evening it moved through every channel that had once carried whispers about Nora's breakdown at her own wedding. The story had finally slipped out of Voss' hands and into the world on its own terms. Julian tried, in the weeks that followed, to save what he could. He gave a single interview, stiff and rehearsed, blaming subordinates, blaming pressure, blaming a father who had taught him that obedience mattered more than conscience. Each answer saved a little of himself and condemned someone else, until there was almost nothing left of the man who had once stood so confidently at the center of that ballroom. Reginald fared no better. Faced with the financial trail, the falsified safety records, and Marisol's testimony, he retreated into the language of governance and delegation, insisting he had trusted his teams completely, until a single message surfaced instructing staff to handle inconvenient reports before they reached outside eyes. There was no dramatic confession. There didn't need to be. Intention had already written itself into his own words. The criminal referral moved slowly, as these things always do, but it moved. Voss Industrial's public contracts were suspended pending independent review. 2 of the falsified vendor companies were frozen mid-transaction. Marisol received formal whistleblower protection and, months later, a quiet note of thanks from the family of one of the 2 men who had died in the fire, a widow who had once tried and failed to be heard, and who now sat, for the first time, in a room where people actually listened. Nora did not celebrate the way people expect a wronged woman to celebrate. There was no triumphant press conference, no long list of insults finally allowed to be spoken aloud. When a reporter asked her, on the courthouse steps, if this had all been about revenge for what happened at her wedding, she paused before answering, because the question carried exactly the distortion Julian had once hoped to plant. She said that revenge wanted pain, but justice wanted limits, that a single act of violence had forced her to see a much larger pattern of harm, one that had reached far beyond her own life and touched people who never had a name in any headline. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The calm in her answer did more damage to what remained of the Voss reputation than any accusation could have. In the months that followed, some of her old clients quietly disappeared from her calendar, unnerved by proximity to scandal. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not miss them. Others came specifically because of what she had done, trusting a lawyer who clearly would not trade integrity for comfort. With Wesley and a small, careful team, she opened a new practice focused on corporate accountability and protection for whistleblowers, people like Marisol, ordinary employees who had simply refused to look away. She named the firm plainly, without embellishment, Bellamy and Associates. When her mother saw the freshly painted sign for the first time, she ran her fingers slowly across the letters, the way someone touches a scar that has finally, truly healed. On the first morning in the new office, boxes still stacked against the walls and the smell of fresh paint lingering in the air, Nora sat alone at her desk before anyone else arrived. She thought about the wedding dress she had finally donated without ceremony weeks earlier, about the ring left behind on a silver tray, about the low, terrible sound of a hand striking her face in a hallway that had once smelled of white peonies. That memory no longer cut like a blade. It had become something else entirely, not a wound she carried, but a marker of the exact moment she had stopped negotiating her own worth to fit inside someone else's story. Priya arrived with newspapers under her arm and a grin she couldn't quite suppress. Wesley followed with a box of files and dry jokes about finally having somewhere legitimate to store them. Diane came last, carrying a small bouquet of yellow flowers. Never white again, she'd said firmly, not for a long while, and the 3 of them filled the quiet new rooms with noise and light in a way that made the old fear feel, for the first time, like something safely behind glass. That afternoon, a young engineer named Talia Reyes sat nervously across from Nora's desk, hands trembling slightly as she described safety violations she'd reported at her own company and the quiet threats that had followed. Nora recognized the fear immediately, the exact shape of it, and she did not offer easy comfort or a heroic story. She explained the risks plainly, the protections available, the steps that would need to be taken carefully and in order. By the time Talia left, her shoulders had lowered by an inch, which in that line of work was sometimes the truest measure of hope. As evening settled over the city, Nora turned off the lights in her new office one by one, leaving only the small lamp on her desk burning steady in the dark. Outside, the windows of 100 other buildings blinked on in the dusk, each one, she imagined, hiding its own quiet arguments and quiet courages. She thought of Julian only briefly now, not with hatred, only with a settled kind of clarity, a man who had mistaken control for love and had lost, in the end, both. She did not wish him ruin. She wished only that he would never again mistake silence for permission, or an apology for a way back in. Before locking the door behind her, she opened the same black notebook that had traveled with her since the night of the wedding and wrote one final line beneath months of names, dates, and evidence. Never again build a life for someone who needs to shrink you to feel whole. She closed the cover gently, without drama, because she had learned by now that real endings rarely make noise. They live instead in the doors a person chooses not to open again, the hands they choose to hold, and the fights they agree to finish without becoming the very thing they set out to stop. Outside, the night air was clean and cold, and for the first time in a long while, Nora Bellamy walked into it without looking back once.